Hi everybody, it's Rich. Welcome to week 3. So this week we're going to look at retrieving data. Last week in our second lesson we took a look at capturing data online and saving that information to our database using some PHP and some SQL. So this week we want to look at how do we create dynamic web pages. If you've completed activity 1, you will have already looked at one or two at a couple of websites and tried to look at what content on there is dynamic and changing and what's static. A couple of the sites I like to look at each day, let's just pull up, this is usually the first place I go every day to check my latest news. So if I scroll from top down to the bottom, almost everything we see between the top and bottom really is dynamic content. My header is going to be the same. We can expect to find the logo here, and our navigation is going to be consistent if I go from one page to another. But virtually everything underneath this navigation bar is going to be dynamic. So our ads, our pictures, our videos, the list of articles, the heading of our section here, media library, the subcategories, all of this stuff is dynamic. This stuff shows up because I clicked on the sports link in my navigation bar. If I click on the technology link, then again, we've got a few static items at the top. Everything else is dynamic. We have completely different content, images, videos, ads, links. And then down at the bottom, we kind of see this visual cue, this separator bar, and then we've got this fairly static footer. So this is going to be the same on every page. And you'll notice if we look at a few other sites, you'll sort of see this structure tends to be remarkably consistent from site to site. So on Amazon, we've got our header and our search bar up at the top. Down at the very bottom, we have, much like Globe and Mail, we've got a static footer with a lot of links. These links are going to be pretty much the same page to page. So if I click on a particular item to load a different page, notice my header really hasn't changed. Now there are a few dynamic pieces in the header, things like it says hello. If I sign in, it will show my name. It also shows how many items I have in my shopping cart right now. If I put this item in my cart, we've got a dynamic piece here. Underneath our header, really everything here is dynamic content. So I want to go and look up a product that they sell. The images change from product to product, the description, how the product is made, what related products or what products other customers bought, reviews, information about the author. All of these things are dynamic until we get down to the very bottom, and then we have our static footer. I'm sure, and I'm filming this video even before you guys have had a chance to do activity 1 where you do your web research. I'm sure many of you said, yeah, my first website every day is Facebook. Well, here's Facebook. At the top again, what do we see? Static logo and a static login. That stuff doesn't really change. And at the very bottom, here's our little kind of third of a page column footer. And everything in between our header and the footer, it's all dynamic. Okay, so the statistics, the logo, the banner image, map, photos, all of these things change depending on whose Facebook profile that we're looking at. And as well as all these other links, all of these things are static, that whoever at Georgian has access to the Facebook profile, they can change all of this information. So all of this information, Facebook doesn't have a separate profile page for every user. There's really only a single profile page, but all of the content is pulled dynamically from the Facebook database depending on what profile and what page we're looking at. So this is probably the biggest part of creating dynamic web applications, is what we call, I can't remember if we talked about it last week. We use the acronym CRUD, create, read, update, and delete. So last week we used the web and we looked at the create part where our users could give us new information, we could save it to our database. This week we're really looking at the reading part. So this is kind of a two-way operation. How does this work? Our user wants to see something, they click on a link or they type a URL into their address bar requesting a page. And that page contains dynamic content. So in this case, the dynamic content is the latest technology articles on Globe and Mail. In this case, the dynamic content is information about John Krakauer's book Into Thin Air. And on this page, the dynamic content is the entire content of the Georgian College Facebook profile. No matter what it is, here's what happens. Our page says, okay, what is it the user is supposed to see on this page, and where do we get the data? So the first step is our PHP page has to make a connection to our database, much like we did last week when we were saving data. We've got to go and we've got to issue an SQL instruction to tell the database exactly what information should be displayed on the page. We use SQL to fetch the data, and then we're going to take PHP to process, read that data back, and package or present it for our web page. Now there's a bunch of different ways, a bunch of different sort of wrapping or packaging that we can use to show our data in different ways, and this week we'll explore some of them. I like to think of it this way: if you're invited over to a friend's house for dinner and you're going to take them, maybe you're going to take them a bottle of wine, there's a lot of different ways we can wrap or package or present that. One of our options would be that we could simply walk in the front door and hand our friend a bottle of wine. But we might also put it in a bag, we might put it in wrapping paper, we might put it in a box. It's the same thing inside, but we can package or present it in different ways. And we're going to look at how we can use HTML to present dynamic data in different ways. We can display it as text, we could display it as images, we might display data in a grid of rows and columns. Let's see, we can pull one up quickly. So what would this look like? Here's our current NHL standing. So we have a grid of rows and columns. So this is a very common option. We might also put, we can see here, one of our other options is drop downs, right? So this drop down is dynamically filled from the Blackboard database that shows all of the courses that are currently related to my login. So it's based on both the login and the current semester that shows into this drop down list. So we're going to look at doing all these things. Okay? So the first thing we're going to want to do is open our code editor. So I'm going to work with Expression Web again. I'll open up my code editor. I'm going to create a new PHP file. Now last week, if we have a quick look at our database in class, I'll log into my DreamHost account. So last week we built a movies table. We added a few movies into it. We look at what's in here. So what we want to do is create a web page, our own web page, that basically reproduces the list of movies. Eventually we'll want to put it into a grid of rows and columns, but for now we just want to say print out, let's say, the movie titles on a page. So let's look at how we do this. So I'm going to save this file. I'm going to create a week 3 folder for today. I should already have a week 3 folder. So I'm going to call this one movies. I'll call it movie titles for starters. And I'll change my heading. Titles. Save my changes. So now what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to write a PHP script that will go ahead and connect to our database and show the movie titles that we entered last week. So the first thing we're going to need is a set of PHP tags, because we're going to need server-side script. Remember, our HTML is dumb. HTML has no ability to connect to our database, run a database query, and store and process the results. We are going to use HTML to display the results, but that's it. So we'll put some comments on here. What we'll do is kind of walk through the process first with our comments. We'll list all the things we're going to have to do, and then we'll add the code one piece at a time. So the first thing we're going to need to do is connect to the database. After we're connected, we'll write the SQL query to fetch all the movie titles. Then we'll execute the query and store the results in an array. Once we have our results, we want to loop through our array and display each movie title to the page. And lastly, we'll disconnect. So we've got 5 steps, and we're going to need, I don't know, maybe roughly 10 lines of code to do this. So our connection is going to be exactly the same as what we did last week. I'll create a variable called $con. We said, as we've said in previous classes, all PHP variables have to begin with a $, and we are going to use the PDO library, the PHP data objects, and our code is exactly the same as it was last week. We're going to use the MySQL library. Our host is going to be our DreamHost MySQL server at this address. My database name is GC R Freeman. In yours, you'll just replace the R Freeman with your 9-digit student number. My username is also GC R Freeman. Again, yours will be GC and your student number. And then you'll put in your DreamHost password. So that's going to be step 1. Step 2, we'll create an SQL variable, and I'll write an SQL query. Now we only want the movie titles. We could run a query and use select star, but select star will select all 4 of these columns, which so far we're not interested in. We're only interested in displaying these values, so there's no need for us to select into memory these other columns. So I'll just say select title from movies. Then we're going to create a new command using our connection and our SQL query from above. We're going to execute our command. Now this code basically is the same as what we did last week. It's a little simpler because we haven't filled in parameters, but the last thing we want to do is we need to take the results of our query and store those in a local array. So I'm going to create an array called movies. And if we call the fetch all method of our command object, this will take our data and fill it, copy it into our local array called movies. Now there are a few different versions of the fetch command. I'm generally going to use fetch all. That's the simplest one. If you want to look at some of the different iterations, you can check on php.net for that. So now what we want to do, we have, in this case, in my database, I'm going to have 4 different movie titles. The great thing about how we're going to do this is our code is going to run no matter whether we have 4 movie titles, 44 movie titles, or 400, 4,000 movie titles. We're going to use a loop and loop through that array until we've output and displayed all of the movies. So we can use a structure in PHP. We have a loop called a for each loop. So what we want to do is loop through. So for each one of our movies, and then we're going to call the current one a movie singular. So this array represents the entire set of data that comes from our query, and this represents the current item in our loop. And all we want to do is display to the screen using the PHP echo command that we used last week. What we want to display is the movie title. So here's how we access it. We're going to use our movie variable, which is the current movie, and then in square brackets and single quotes, we're going to put in the name of the column that we want to display. The last thing we're going to do is we want each movie title to appear on a new line. So not only do we want to display the movie title, but then we want to use an HTML tag for presentation. We want to use an HTML line break tag that will add a line break after every movie title. Now, PHP has a really weird, I think we looked at it back last week. It has a really strange concatenation or append operator. In most languages, it's an ampersand or a plus sign, which is intuitive. In PHP, that operator is actually a dot. So I'm going to append on an HTML line break tag after every movie. The last thing I need to do is simply disconnect to free up that resource for another user. So there's my page. Now to try this out, our PHP scripts have to live on a web server, so we're going to have to connect with FileZilla and upload this page to the web server and then try and run it in our browser. So I'm going to go to FileZilla. I've saved my connection previously, so I'm just going to click on my little drop down to Site Manager, click on DreamHost, and go into my course. I have a week 3 folder already set up. You'll need to create one. So I'm going to browse to my local week 3 folder. And then I'm going to copy my movie titles to the server, and then we can load it in the browser. So now that my file is uploaded, we need to try it out. So here I've got inside my week 3 folder. So now I will browse to GCR Freeman, Computer Studies, COMP1006, week 3, movie titles.php. And now our page prints out 4 movie titles. Now there's a couple things I want to show you that are important. The first one is, notice that I've spelled title all in lowercase here inside my SQL, as well as here when I'm outputting that column value. It's really important that the name matches exactly, that it matches exactly what we have here within our database. Let me show you what happens if I change this, and let's say I use a capital T here. So I've just uploaded my changed file, and now if I refresh, my movie titles go away. PHP doesn't throw an error, but it simply doesn't recognize any column spelt with a capital T. So in order to fix that, I'm going to need to make sure that T is lowercase. So I'm just going to put it back. So now when I refresh my page, my titles come back. So we haven't really done much in terms of using HTML for presentation. We've only output the titles, but it's a start. The good news is the process that we followed here, this process of connecting to our database, running an SQL query, fetching the data, and then using that for each looping structure, we can use to fill almost any kind of page, whether it's this one, or this one, or this one. They're all going to work in a very similar way. So what we want to do now is we basically want to recreate this page. We're going to create a separate page, and instead of just showing the movie titles, we're also going to show the year, the length, and the URL, but we're going to format this nicely with some HTML wrapping. What we're going to do is use HTML table tags for this. So what we want to do now is we're going to build a new page. We're basically going to follow the same logic here, except all we're really going to change is the wrapping and packaging so that we can build out a grid and do more than just show the movie title. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new PHP page. And we'll give it a title of movies. And I will immediately save my page with the name movies.php. So we're going to go through and do most of the same things. We'll put PHP tags on, and we'll put our comments on. 90% of what we're going to do is really the same. So we are going to connect, write the SQL query, execute the query, and store the results. We will start the HTML display table. So this is new. We'll loop through the results and show each movie in a new row and each value in a new column. And lastly, we'll disconnect. So our connection line is going to be the same. I'll use my con variable consistently. We'll create a new PDO connection. Again, we're connecting to the same host. This is really never going to change through the course. Again, don't forget to replace the R. Freeman part of the connection with your 9-digit student number. Same with your username. And then your DreamHost password. Now our query is going to slightly be modified. On our movie titles page, we only were selecting the titles. On this page, we want to select all the values. So we can use a shortcut for that. If we say select star, that automatically selects all the columns in our movies table. Next, we'll want to run the query, so I'll create a command object. With our current connection and our current SQL query. I'll execute the query, and I will store the results once again in an array called movies. We use the fetch all command to transfer or copy the results of our query into this array called movies. Now, before we start our loop, we want some headings. If we look at the table on this page, we typically expect to see column headings. And oftentimes those are in a different format. You'll notice here these are bolded. So how are we going to do that? Before we loop, we're going to use an echo command, and we're going to create an HTML table tag. And in here, for starters, I'm going to add a border attribute, 1 pixel border. So we have some grid lines. Then for our header row, we'll add a table head tag. And then to create individual headers, we'll use HTML th tags. So that'll create, there's our first table heading for title. And by using th, we should get a bold font automatically. We then want, so our columns are going to be year, length, and URL. I'm going to capitalize the first letter of each word because this is just literal text. So we can end our header row. And then before our loop, the last thing we're going to do is open the table body with a tbody tag. So this will create a new table with 4 column headings in the top. Now we'll use our for each loop. We're going to loop through our list of movies, and we'll call each record a movie. And now we want to display the movie title, year, length, and URL. But for each one, the first thing we want to do is we want to create a new row. We want the movie stacked vertically, so every movie is on a new line. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new table row with a tr tag. Then after we've created a new row, we want to create a new table column or table data, so we use td. Now inside of our first table cell, we want to display the movie title. So I'm going to close out my quote, my literal tag, and I'm going to append on the movie title. So this will put the movie title into the first cell of each row. What do we need to do next? Well, we need to now close that first column. And just to make my code easier, I'm just going to put the code for each column on a new line. PHP wraps, it ignores the line breaks. So we just continue with our echo command. We'll create a second column. And in here, we're going to display the movie year. Then we'll close column number 2. In our third column, we want the movie length. And in our fourth column, we want to display the movie's website. Now, after our fourth column, we also need to end our table row. So this way, when the first movie is done printing, the second movie will start on a new line. And then we'll terminate. So this is really one command. We start here with echo. We could write it all on one line if we wanted and terminate it here. I just find the code's a little bit easier to break a long echo statement up. Now, one thing I've noticed I've missed, and I can tell this is where my editor helps me. Notice my tags are red. The red should be closing here, but notice my bracket is in red. The reason for that is I have forgotten to finish my single quote. Notice when I put that in, the rest of those characters go back to black as they should be. I'm going to save this, and the last thing we need to do, actually, before we disconnect, one step I forgot is close the table and body. So now we'll close our tBody tag that we created up here on line 25. And lastly, we'll close the table itself. Then to disconnect. So all we need to do now to try our page out, save our file, go back to FileZilla. I'll refresh my local list of files. Now I have movies over here. I'm going to need to copy the file up to the server, and then we can have a look at it in our browser. So I've uploaded my file to the server, and now I'll go try in my browser. Rather than loading my movie titles page, we're going to want to load the movies page. So here's what we get. We get our titles, years, lengths, and URLs all in a grid. And if we view our source, here is our HTML wrapping or packaging so that our dynamic data is formatted in grid format. So now that we have our table displaying, I'm going to do a couple other things to improve it. The first one is that we want to take these values and let's make them into links. Right now I can't click on these. If we're going to display a web page, we should probably make it the user's life easier, our user's life easier, so they can actually click on it. So what we're going to do is around the URL values, we're going to want to use an HTML anchor tag. So before we print out the name of the movie, we're going to add an A tag. And after the movie, before our column closes, we'll add an end A tag. Now the other thing we're going to need to do inside of our A tag, I can upload the page this way and go back and refresh. So we've now got A tags, but what our A tags are missing is an href attribute. So for starters, if we just put in it as a href, we'll just leave this attribute blank for a moment. We'll do this in steps. I'm going to save and re-upload. And now if I refresh, notice all of these become links. Now the links aren't active. When I click them, they don't go anywhere because we haven't specified an href value. We'll do that next. So now what we want to do is we need to copy our movie URL value into our href property of our anchor tag. So what I'm going to do is add a single quote and then append on and add another single quote. So I've added this inside of my href tag. We're closing out of our literal tag so that we can append our PHP variable inside of our attribute quotes. So I'm going to save and re-upload again. We don't see any visible change, but now if I click on one of these, my link is actually active and it takes me off to the movie site. So I can click on any movie and it will take me to the appropriate URL. Now the last thing I want to do is add some formatting. We haven't really talked about this so far. All the pages we've built, the form we built last week was pretty plain, and so far our table is plain. We've got a boring font. Our table is squished together. Now this course, the focus is on the programming aspect. We're really not getting too into design, but we do want to use some basic CSS, which you learned in semester 1, some cascading style sheets for layout. So we could spend time writing our own, but we've got an even better solution. The solution is to use the world's most popular CSS framework. So let's go and have a look. Where do we get this framework? This framework is called Twitter Bootstrap. Called Twitter Bootstrap because originally it was created by a couple of web designers who worked at Twitter. So the URL is getbootstrap.com. I'm going to click on that link. Now you can read, there's some great tutorials on using Bootstrap over on YouTube. I'm just going to show you a quick and easy way. We can either download the files directly, or to make it even easier, we can actually simply link to the Bootstrap files by copying and pasting two style sheet links as well as a JavaScript link into our page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that code. I'm going to highlight all of it with my cursor, and I'll just click the copy button. And then I'm going to return to my page. I'm going to scroll up to the top, and inside of my head tag, underneath my title, this is typically where we put CSS links. I'm just going to paste those links. So we've got a link to the Bootstrap style sheet, a link to their sample theme, as well as a link to their JavaScript. So I'm going to save that change. I'm going to upload to the server, and we'll see what adding that Bootstrap style sheet does. So I've pasted all of this code into the header of my file. I'm going to re-upload my file. And now, even without applying any of the specific styles, if I refresh, you'll notice our font changes and the way that our table looks is different. We're going to make a few more changes. So how do we know? How do we explore what the Bootstrap theme looks like? Well, all I have to do is click on this basic template. Sorry, actually, I want the examples. And when I click on the Bootstrap theme, I can see some of the elements. So there's lots of stuff in the Bootstrap CSS. We've got different size, different colored buttons and links. We have different labels for different layouts for tables. We're going to use this layout. It's got classes for things like labels, images, forms, buttons, etc. So the way I use this, let's say I want to have a page with a red button. You know, I want a button this size. All I do in my browser, if I decide this is the element from the Bootstrap style sheet I want, I can just right click, and in Firefox I choose Inspect Element, And I can see from the class that this is a label space label danger class. So if I apply this class to any label, I'm going to get this red label with a bold white font. So we'll come back to that. So what I actually want is to use this table. I've got alternating colors. My table's nice and stretched out. Our table here is kind of jammed up together. So I want my table to span the page, and I want the background colors to be alternating. So if I inspect my table, we can see that they've given it a class of table space table dash striped. So what we're going to want to do is remove the border that we put on our table and apply this Bootstrap class definition instead for formatting. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go to line 34 where we have our HTML table tag. I'm going to take out the border equals 1, and instead I'm going to add the attribute class equals table striped. So I'm going to save that change, go back to my FTP client and upload it. And now when we refresh, by applying our table striped class, notice our table is automatically scaled to 100% width. We have nice spacing and we have alternating background colors. So if I inspect the element, we can see that our class has been applied. Now there's one other neat Bootstrap class I'm going to add on to it. One of the other things we might see in the sample, we might not, is I want the ability, Bootstrap offers a class that when the user rolls their mouse over each item in the table, the background color of that row will change. So we can add one other class after the table stripe definition. We're also going to add a class called table hover. So I'm going to save that change and upload. So now you can see when I mouse over, harder to see over the light gray, but when I mouse over one of the white rows, the background changes to a darker color. Okay. So this page is done for now. We'll come back to it in another lesson. So we've built two dynamic pages today. This one's starting to look like an actual website. We're going to do one other thing. We've looked at just spitting out our page titles directly to the browser with no formatting. We've now seen how to build an HTML grid. The last thing I want to show you is how we can populate our movie titles into a drop-down list. So we're going to build two pages. We're going to build one page where we have a drop-down list that is filled with the movie. I'll put in a title of select movie, and I'll save this one as select movie.php. Now, our drop-down list where our user can pick, that's actually a type of user input control. We said last week all user input controls have to live inside of an HTML form, so that's going to be the first thing that we need on here. We'll need a form tag and closing form tag. And in my form tag, we're going to put in a couple of attributes. We're going to set up the method, which we said last week will almost always be post. And we'll just create an action, which will be the page this loads. That said, we'll call this page display movie.php. So what we want here is a label. And the HTML control we're going to use is called a select control. So we're going to give it a name, title. So what we want to do in here, rather than hard coding in the names of the movies, what we want is we want to use PHP to select all the movie titles from our database and add each title dynamically to our drop-down list. So anytime we add, edit, or delete a movie in the database, our drop-down list is updated automatically. So what we're going to do is add our PHP code right in here. So I'm going to enter my PHP tags, and notice this is going right inside of our select box. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to connect. We're going to write and execute an SQL query to get the movie titles. We'll loop through the movies and add each one to the drop-down list. And lastly, we're going to disconnect. So again, 90% of what we're doing here is what we've already done. The only part that's going to be different is the wrapping, the packaging around the movie titles. How are we going to put it in the dropdown? We're not going to use HTML table tags. This isn't a grid. We're not just going to spit the movie title out to the page. It's got to go inside of our select box. So we'll connect again. So I'll put in my credentials, just like I did on my other pages. We'll write our SQL query. We don't need all the columns, we just need the title column. So we will select title from movies. That query will get us the movie titles. Then we'll create our new command object by calling the prepare function of our connection. We will execute our command to run our query, and we'll store the results in an array called movies. So this code is identical to what we did on our first page. I like to write my disconnect line right now, just in case we forget to do it later. So we're still going to use that same for each loop we've used twice before today. We'll loop through our movies. We'll call each individual record a movie. But we're going to need to use different HTML wrapping in order to generate this drop-down list. What we need is a tag. We will echo out. We need a tag that says option. And then inside of each option, we want to append or display the movie title. And then we'll close our option. So if we have 4 movie titles, we will have 4 sets of option and end option tags within our drop-down list. The last thing we want to add is a button to let our user submit their movie choice. So I will add a button, which is a submit button, and the button can simply say go. So I'm going to save this file, upload it to the web server, and we can have a look at it. So if I refresh my local files, here's my new select movie page. I can upload it to the server. And now in my browser, we'll have a look. Now I seem to have gotten an error. My error doesn't display, so I better have a look at why. If I want to see the error, if I view the source, oops, I had a problem. I didn't put in my correct login. I'll just have to fix that. I had mistyped my username. I've changed it now and re-uploaded. So now if I refresh, so now when I refresh, each movie's filled in the drop-down list. If I view the source of the page, we've got a set of option tags around each movie title. Exactly what we want. Now when we click go, we'll get a 404 page because our button is calling displayMovie.php, which we haven't built yet. That's our last page. We're just going to want to grab the title that was selected and then display the other values of that movie. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new PHP page for today. I'll put in a title of movie details. And I'll save this as display-movie.php. We'll put on our PHP tags. And we'll write the comments of what we're going to do. So the first thing will be get the selected movie. From the form post and store the title in a variable. Then we'll connect to our MySQL database. We'll write and execute query to fetch the selected movie. Then, even though we're only going to have one record, I find it simple just to use a loop one time to display the movie details. And then we'll disconnect. So we did this last week. I'm just going to create a variable called title. And we're going to fill it from our drop-down list using $post title. So this means from the form post and from the control on our form called title. So that will be, there's our drop-down name title. So whatever movie is picked in that drop-down, that movie title is stored in this object, $_post title. Now we need to do our connection. We'll start to look familiar because we're going to do it more and more often. Host is, type is MySQL. Now our query is going to be a little different this time because even though we want all the columns from our movies table, we don't want all the rows. We only want the selected movie. So the first part of our query will look familiar, but instead of everything, we want to filter it. We need a where clause. We want to say where our title equals and the selected movie title. Now we're going to need to create our command object. And before we run the query, we're also going to add a parameter to fill in so we can pass in the title of our movie. So like we did last week, we're filling our placeholder, our parameter called title. We want to populate it with our title variable. We're going to set this parameter out as a string, and I'm just going to check how many characters we've allowed for our title. So we said our title column was a maximum of 50 characters. So we'll supply 50 as the length of our parameter. Now we can execute our query. And store the result. I'll come down to the bottom and disconnect. And now what we want to do is loop through, even though we only have one record. So what we'll simply output here is our year, length, and URL. So I'm going to use an echo command. We'll output our movie year. And then I'll put in maybe a line break. I won't close that quote, we'll keep going. So on the next line, we'll output the length. On a second line break. I want to do two other things here. This will show the movie year, length, and URL. We have the title, but we haven't displayed it. So maybe before this, I'll move this to another new line. I'll take out that single quote here. We can add in the movie title. The last thing we want to do is make this a link. So I'm going to add an href tag here, like we did previously. I'll add an end link tag, and then we will append on so inside of our double quotes, this is how we can dynamically set URL of this link. So again, just to review what we're doing, we're grabbing what the user picked from our drop-down list on the previous page. We're going to connect to the database. We're going to run a query to get all of the information about that movie. We need to pass in the title as a 50-character string to our SQL query, so our database knows which movie we want to look at. We're going to execute the query and store the results, and then we're going to loop through our one record and output the different values to our page. So I'm going to save and upload this, and we'll try it out. So now if I go back to my browser, if I've picked Everest, it shows me the values and links to the correct URL. I can pick any movie in my database, and now we have a dynamic movie detail page. So this week we've really looked at how we can go through this process of building dynamic web pages. The neat thing is we've done this in several different ways. We've built a grid today, we've built a drop-down list today, and we've displayed a record that's been dynamically selected by the user. We've also looked at Bootstrap. I encourage you to go to getbootstrap.com, examine and play around with some of these styles. We're going to use them each week moving forward. And you can start to see that, hopefully you can start to see the building blocks of how we put dynamic web pages together. So follow along with the video, try to get this set of pages working, and they will help you to proceed with Lab 3, which is due this week, and it's giving you a chance to further work with this selecting and displaying of data from a database. We'll see you guys next week.